Hi, Bella.
Hello. What's up?
Not much. How are you this morning?
Good. Are you presenting anything today?
I'm just helping out with the emerging mobility for a few slides.
Fun.
Yeah, you can hear me okay?
Yep. Audio
Cool.
is good.
Thanks for the sound check.
No problem. Hopefully technology works today.
I know, right?
Hi, Charlie. All right, audio is good.
All right, good morning, everybody. We've reached critical mass here. We'll probably get started. This is the December 2nd meeting of the Transportation Technical Advisory Committee. Continuing to meet virtually. If you'd like to participate, there's instructions on the screen for how to join the meeting. You can also join by phone. And remember to use *9 to raise your hand, *6 to mute and unmute. Bella, if you'd please do roll call.
Sure can. Just a sec here. All right, Jeremy Keene,
Present.
Corey Aldridge,
Present.
Jane Stack,
Present.
Sarah Cofield,
Present.
Ellen Buchanan,
Present.
Aaron Pehan,
Present.
Jacqueline Smith,
Present.
Jack Krauser.
Karen Hughes, proxy for Chet Krauser.
Thank you. Juniper Davis, Donna Gawker.
Grant Carlton, proxy for Donna Gockler.
Thanks. Ryan Hammond,
I'm here.
Lynn Hellegard,
Present.
Ben Weiss, Ian Ortlieb, Brian Elstad, Bynum Jackson, Eva Rock, Katie Potts.
Vicky Cernich, proxy for Katie Potts.
Thank you. And lastly, Emily Brock.
Present.
Thank you. All right, that's all.
Thank you, Bella. We have minutes from November 4th. Are there any comments or corrections to the minutes? Okay, seeing none, those will stand approved. On to public comment. Any comment on items not on the agenda? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to new business. We have 3 items today. First one is presentation and update on the Transportation Options Action Plan. Aaron Wilson.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. So just wanted to come and give an update to all of you on this project. This is something, if you'll remember, it came out of the long range transportation plan as one of our needs to address issues that may be in transportation investments or issues outside of sort of the hard infrastructure. We're calling it the Transportation Options Action Plan, and I'll go through sort of a background, since it's been a while since we've talked about this project, and just give a quick reminder on why we're doing this and how we got here. And then we've done our first round of stakeholder interviews and have been sort of quietly working on this project in the background for the last 3 or 4 months. So feels like a good opportunity to give an update with some summaries of what we heard from the stakeholders, and then an overview of what we're moving on to next in terms of our peer community evaluations and how we're going to structure the action plan and recommendations. So good opportunity to get some feedback from all of you before we get too much further along in our research and starting to craft those recommendations. So just starting off, I think it's helpful. This is something we've done with all of our stakeholders and steering committees, is just first making sure we're all on the same page about what we're talking about when we reference transportation options. So this is really looking at those programs and policies and education, sort of what we might call soft infrastructure around transportation. It doesn't include our larger infrastructure investments. Those are covered in other parts of the long-range transportation plan. But this is intended to really focus on those things to support those transportation investments. So things like our education and outreach, whether that's wayfinding, our ongoing programs, safety messaging, one-on-one engagement with members of the community, thinking about things like incentives. So in Missoula, we already have some of these, like zero fare transit. There are a whole lot of other opportunities out there around incentives, things like mobility wallets, other kinds of rewards. We're already doing things like guaranteed ride home in Missoula. So those are kind of on the incentive side to try to encourage people to use the transportation investments that we're making. And then going through other aspects like policies, whether that's parking management or regulatory policies that we have for new development or employers. And then the technology and sort of what we call small scale infrastructure, things like bike racks, ride matching services, specific apps. There's a lot of emerging types of services like what's called mobility as a service. So where you have maybe one app that shows you all of your different transportation modes and options like transit, car share, bike share, all ride hailing, potentially all of those kind of wrapped up in one app would be an example of technology aspects of transportation options. So just wanted this quick overview of what we're focused on and what we're talking about when we're talking about transportation options in this project. So then the context and need of why we're doing this study, I think it's important to go back and look at what we did in terms of setting the stage for doing this project. And this has come out of a number of different plans and projects over the last couple of years. One of which is the city's growth policy called for putting more focus on encouraging and creating use of our investments in multimodal transportation, and really looking at planning for things like parking and accessibility and transit and how those work together with our land use system or our land use growth pattern. And then in our most recent updated long range transportation plan, we spent a lot of time on that, but really looked at reinforcing our multimodal transportation goals and strategies for accommodating growth in the region. And had a number of recommendations on how we can do that. One of which was going through this effort of doing some more planning around transportation options and how we are promoting those in Missoula. We also have our mode split goals. So our community has committed to trying to reduce single occupancy vehicle trips and instead shift more into sustainable modes like biking and walking and transit or car share or other kinds of modes that use our system more efficiently. And so we established a number of common values and goals in that plan that are helping us guide this work. But again, building on this idea that we need to do more than just invest in infrastructure if we're going to meet those goals in the long range transportation plan, that we really need to think about how those investments interact with our land use and development and growth and employment around the region, and even thinking about what sorts of transportation options exist out there that aren't necessarily just building infrastructure. So we have a number of, we're not starting at zero on this. We have a lot of great programs and services in Missoula today that we can build on, and which is, I think, a good place to be, that we're not starting from ground zero and having to build out an entire transportation options program. We have the work that Missoula in Motion has done around education and outreach and different kinds of programs like the Way to Go Club. It really just encouraging people and helping people make that shift into sustainable modes. We also have our other partners around the region, the Missoula Valley TMA, helping with the iRide van pools, connecting to our more rural parts of the county. The University of Montana's Office of Transportation does a lot of work around and partnering with Missoula in Motion and other transportation providers to help lessen the transportation impact of the university. And then Mountain Line does a ton of outreach and also partners with us on the education and encouragement and promoting transit as a viable mode of transportation. And then other groups like Free Cycles or some of our sort of nonprofit community partners are also out there doing good work to highlight the the opportunities around sustainable transportation and these transportation option modes. So we also have talked a lot about the need to do a program like this and how it relates to some of our other issues around the region. The first and foremost is that we're growing. Missoula is not going to stop growing in the near future. This is not news to any of you. We talk about this a lot. We talked about it in the long range transportation plan, but we need to do more to utilize our existing infrastructure more efficiently if we're going to meet those goals. And the way that we've identified meeting that growth need in transportation is by increasing the use of sustainable transportation and a fully multimodal transportation system. So not just relying on single occupancy vehicle trips to get people where they need to go. And so that is really driving the need on why we need to do this. We also have policies around housing affordability. We know transportation is a big household cost, and there's a lot of opportunities here to think about how we can reduce that cost, not just through individual households' expenses on vehicles and transportation, but also in our development patterns and how are we building out housing and new development in ways that we can try to lessen that cost through more effective use of our transportation system. And then we have climate action plans around reducing our emissions. And a big part of that is going to be shifting away from single occupancy vehicles, which are one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gases in our region through our transportation system. And so we have some existing tools in place today around our codes and policies, but really there isn't a lot of focus on really integrating a multimodal transportation system when we're thinking about development and we're thinking about growth, other than the way that we've been investing in infrastructure. And so this plan will hopefully, the intent of this plan is to look through all of that and try to identify ways that we can have a more integrated and coherent way of addressing transportation. So with that, we're going to explore a number of different things in this project. Three sort of primary aspects of transportation options, the first of which is programs. So looking at what we're already doing around Missoula in Motion or Mountain Lines programming and our education and outreach, and look at what other innovative things are happening around the country in our peer communities and ways that we can really maximize our investment in the programmatic side. We're also going to look at opportunities for incentives and requirements. So thinking about new development or growth in new employers around the region and ways that we can either incentivize or require investments in and around our public investments in transportation infrastructure. So that we'll go through some of that ways that we might be able to do that, but really thinking about how we go about development requirements a little bit differently. And then finally, looking at opportunities for larger districts and partnerships. So creating approaches where we can pool resources and not necessarily rely on individual developments or organizations or employers, but can bring those resources together in a more efficient way that allows us to be a little bit more successful. So that all of that will come together in our action plan. We have some sort of guiding goals and principles around how we're approaching this. And these came out of conversations with our steering committee and other partners. We really want to focus on equity, making sure that we're adequately expanding access to all members of our community and really thinking hard about those who may rely on these transportation options more than others, those who can't drive or don't have access to vehicles or who we can improve through reduced household transportation costs, or that aspect of expanding transportation options. We also want to make sure that there's flexibility built into whatever our recommendations are, that we don't have too rigid of a system of either requirements or incentives or how we're approaching this, knowing that every development and every program is a little bit different, but we have some common goals that we want to move towards. So thinking about how we can creatively allow flexibility to get us towards that outcome that we're looking for. And then we want to make sure that it's easily implementable. So we're not creating a whole host of new regulatory hurdles or work for staff to do, So thinking about what's possible within the context of Missoula and the capacity that we have at the city or with our partners. And then, as I mentioned, having clear and objective requirements so that we are making sure that flexibility is moving us towards that goal and not just opening up flexibility to, to do things that aren't moving us forward. And finally, related to that conversation about districts and partnerships, we want this to be collaborative so that no one group or entity or agency is bearing the sole burden of this, that we are thinking about transportation options collectively and how that fits into each part of the work that all of us do across the city and across the region. So the other pieces that will fit into that is we're doing an assessment of the city's existing parking requirements to see where there are opportunities for integrating that into any regulatory changes. So what are we doing today? Are there opportunities to increase flexibility through evaluation of our parking requirements? And then finally, we'll have some priority code amendment recommendations. We're not actually going to be developing any code, but knowing that the city has a comprehensive code update that's kicking off in the near future, we want to be ready with clear recommendations on how transportation options can be integrated into our city regulatory code updates in a way that makes sense and sort of brings all the transportation elements together. And so part of that is doing an evaluation of our existing code, like what are we requiring, what kinds of tools do we have, and how can we bring all of those together and maybe streamline it and add in that additional flexibility around requirements and parking and other kinds of transportation improvements, but having those clear outcomes and goals in mind. So hopefully we can hand that over to folks in the land use planning division and they can run with that and use it to develop the code updates that would help us achieve our goals. So just kind of brief overview, we're hoping that there's some real benefits that come out of this project and how transportation options and thinking about those can benefit the region and not just around our transportation system, but thinking about employers and tenants and having more resources available to support transportation needs and creating more affordable transportation options that we are seeing residents and employees and others around the country increasingly wanting those kinds of services and thinking about that creatively and holistically. Hopefully, as we are supporting our hard infrastructure investments in a multimodal transportation system, these transportation options strategies will help with utilization of those and reducing congestion and traffic. So as people shift into transit or biking or walking, we're preserving our existing capacity for vehicular trips. And then increasing our sustainability, focusing on community wellness, sort of all of these ancillary goals that we have around the community. Transportation options can really fit into all of those strategies and help move us in a direction that we want to go as a region. And ultimately, we want to, in an ideal world, we are decreasing development costs by providing more flexibility and creativity in how we're addressing transportation. And so that could be through reduced parking, because we have areas that have enough transit and multimodal connectivity that you can provide less parking and increase your development potential on any given lot, while still meeting our goals of mitigating the transportation impacts of new growth. So a lot of ways that this project, I think, can help us as a region. Obviously transportation is just one aspect of what we do in city government, but it is a really good indicator of how successful we're being on all of our different goals, like housing affordability and growth efficiency and sustainability and equity. So trying to keep all of those things in mind as we move through this project. So with that background, just giving a quick update on what we've done on our initial outreach. The way we've approached this project is not as having a lot of broad community outreach and engagement, but trying to keep it more focused at this stage of developing our strategies and recommendations, and knowing that there will be future processes like code updates and things that will do a lot of public outreach around specific changes that might be made. But we did want to engage with a broad diversity of potential stakeholders in this process. So we had a really good understanding of where we're at as a community and what different concerns might be, and use that to guide our decision-making and the recommendations and some of our next steps. So we have our public approach is has three different prongs to it. The first is our steering committee, which is made up of both public and private partners. So we have city staff there. We have our some of our transportation providers like Mountain Line involved in that steering committee. And then we have some private sector partners like developers and employers who can give us that perspective of as we come up with recommendations to really help guide us. So we're keeping those in mind. Then we have a functional work team that's more internal city focused. That is really a way for us to walk through some of these things. And as we start to develop recommendations, just making sure that we are not creating more work for ourselves that we don't have the capacity for, and to provide some of that technical expertise around either our code or development or transportation specific elements. And finally, kind of our more public side of this is doing stakeholder small group interviews, which we just finished our first round of. And that's where we were really trying to identify some of the issues and opportunities, test ideas, review our recommendations, and make sure we're on the right track as we move through this project. So we just wrapped up our first round of stakeholder focus groups about a month ago. We started those in late October and early November. And the idea was to introduce the project, identify some of our key issues and opportunities, and have a conversation about where we're at today and where we might go, and think about what success of this project might look like. And so I'll go over some of the key themes that we heard during those stakeholder interviews. The first theme that we talked about with all of these groups are thinking about our existing or potential future transportation options programs. So the programmatic side of what we do in transportation options. And there were a number of key themes that came out of those conversations. Probably the most prominent of which was that we need to normalize transportation options. So there's this idea of Missoula having car culture, and people don't necessarily think about, or it's not sort of a standard part of everyone's day to think about transportation options. And if we're going to be successful in whatever we do, we need to have good strategies to really normalize this idea of a multimodal transportation system. And it's kind of one of the key challenges. How do we get over that barrier of the car culture, people needing to have or wanting to have vehicles to get out of town on the weekends or for recreation, and how can we make sure we are creating more opportunities and making sure that other modes are as equally prominent in the community, or building culture around some of those other modes. We also had some good conversations about targeted outreach and service. So thinking about maybe it's special events like through the university and particular football games, or doing some outreach around recreation. I think we've already started to do that a little bit in Missoula around the shuttle service for tubers in the summer. But really thinking about how we target that outreach and services to some of these more specific needs that people have in order to reduce their single occupancy vehicle trips. And then there were a lot of good conversations around providing some targeted travel training. So thinking about transit users or people who may be uncomfortable just getting started on those modes, or particular groups like aging adults who might be quickly approaching a required car-free lifestyle where they can no longer drive, and making sure that they are confident and aware of all of their resources and can get to the stage where they're comfortable utilizing those before they're losing access to a vehicle and having to address those issues without the comfort of knowing how to use transportation options. And then just thinking about how we help both residents and employees reduce vehicle ownership and driving through our additional options and amenities. So how are we communicating that? How are we sort of tying those things together and really creating clear messaging? So the next theme that we focused on and heard a lot about are around requirements and incentives. There were really good conversations that we had both with employers and developers and neighborhood groups around what this might look like in our regulatory environment. Obviously, one of the focuses is on fees and other incentives. So we talked some about how that could be structured, what might work, exploring things like fees in lieu of providing the individual programming, or what might be a successful incentive for doing some of these sort of different kinds of programs and additional work to support multimodal transportation. Density bonuses were one of the things we heard a lot about. How can we make density bonuses work? In Missoula, thinking about the traffic impact analysis, traffic impact study process, and how we can think about multimodal transportation to make that process either easier or provide some more opportunities for developers to do creative things through that, where we're still mitigating the transportation impact, but also giving them some more opportunity to think creatively and do some of the new programming, or thinking about parking and transportation differently. We talked a lot about parking minimums, and we could probably spend the next hour going over all of the fine nuances about parking, but I think we got a lot of really good input about what the market's going to dictate, what developers are struggling with when they're thinking about parking. We talked to neighbors about how parking impacts them on a neighborhood level and what they're looking for, and some of the trade-offs that they were concerned about or looking towards. A good example is we heard from some neighbors that they were more concerned about sort of the residential parking and that impact on their neighborhood than they were about commercial or employer or employment-based parking, that people want to have their vehicle available and at their house for those sorts of recreation opportunities or certain trips, but they weren't necessarily as worried about having a lot of parking around, say, like neighborhood commercial or those types of uses. So in some interesting context that I think we heard about during those conversations. We also talked some about updating bike parking requirements. A lot of that came from city staff in those stakeholder meetings, but just thinking about how we deal with bike parking in our development. And then really just the implementation considerations and making sure we're thinking through how this will be implemented and not creating a lot of unintended consequences or work that we don't have capacity for, or a new process that is too bureaucratic and hard to navigate. So thinking clearly about that. And then in the corridors and partnerships, we had some good discussion about some existing corridors and opportunities to connect in those developing corridors. So areas like the Midtown, downtown, potentially in the Setupcane area, as that begins to develop out, can we think about a potential transportation options district where we can pool resources and think holistically about all of the residential and commercial and retail and employment development that's going on in that area. There was a lot of conversation about paid parking districts outside of downtown, and then how we manage parking in the downtown. So thinking about parking being a little bit more dynamic, potentially going to daily parking for our leased parking sites to increase that flexibility as we look towards a future where maybe people are telecommuting 2 or 3 days a week, but then they still want that parking space. So can we get to more effectively utilize our parking by being more dynamic with how we charge for it, or having daily spaces, or thinking about carpool parking spaces, ways that we can incentivize people to use other modes when they're able to. And then some other ideas that we've talked about. The first one of these came up in every single conversation about just the connection between land use and transportation. And I think that's hopefully not a surprise to any of us, but I was a little bit surprised at how well everyone was able to talk about that, whether they were intending to or not. We had a lot of conversations about things like, the proximity of employment to residential areas or childcare. For parents with children, have a much harder time accessing sustainable or multimodal transportation options because they may have to drive across town for their childcare or school and then get to work in another part of town. And thinking about those relationships is really key. And so I think it was maybe more encouraging than eye-opening that people are thinking about that and aware of that, and something that we really need to be thoughtful of as we continue to do our code updates and think about development. And then we talked some about safety barriers as a limitation on transportation options. And this is something else that we know that we have to increase safety if we want people to use those other modes. And then, as I mentioned, just thinking about staff capacity, funding, and some of those unintended consequences, to be thoughtful about what we're requiring and what that might lead to, and making sure that we're ready for whatever recommendations that we want to implement. So that's kind of a quick summary of the stakeholder interviews. We have a lot more detail, and we'll have some a memo summarizing all of that will come out hopefully within the next couple of weeks, but that's the highlights. So then the next phase of what we're doing is what we're calling our best practice review. So looking at what peers are doing and other communities, and trying to think through like what we can learn from what other people are doing, not just what's working well or not working for us. So we've, rather than break up our peer review by specific cities and what they're doing, we wanted to look at different topic areas in our transportation options action plan and look for different peer communities who are working within that topic area. So thinking about what is that topic and why are we doing it? So what are the strategies and the benefits? Looking at how it works, looking at metrics for success that we need to be able to document how these things are helping us as a region and how they're moving our goals forward. And then looking at peer examples of communities within each one of those topic areas. So looking at 1 or 2 or 3 different cities for each of those topics and how they are addressing that strategy and what's working and what have they learned through their own efforts. So the topic areas that we've identified, and this is an area where I would definitely appreciate any feedback from this committee if you have it, but we wanted to look at transportation option requirements. So this might be regulatory requirements that we're asking of developers or employers, and the different ways that you can do that. So there are regulations around traffic impact analysis or point-based transportation option plans, or event-specific, et cetera. And so we have a number of different peer communities that we've identified who are doing regulatory requirements, and we try to get a good breadth of not just looking at the major metro areas around the country, but different types of communities, maybe as small as Aspen, or different geographic regions around the country, just so we're being thoughtful about that. And one note I want to say about scale and our peer examples, we're trying to avoid this idea that we only have to look at communities of Missoula's size, because I think we need to recognize that Missoula is facing growth pressures and challenges that are very similar to what large metro areas like San Francisco or Boston are facing. It's just a different scale. And so there's a lot that we can learn from seeing what they are doing and what is working in terms of the similar challenges we face around limited space to grow, increasing density, lack of ability to expand capacity, and then think about how we can scale what they're doing down to Missoula's size. So not just thinking about similar size communities, but communities that are facing similar issues to Missoula. So then parking is our next topic area. So thinking about how we can think about parking within transportation options, and have a number of communities that are doing creative things like Buffalo and South Bend. Boulder has some really creative parking strategies that they're using. And then moving into more of the programmatic, so behavior change programs, things that we're already doing, but how can we do more or be more effective in those ongoing activities or create new partnerships around the community. And then finally, transportation options. So looking at things like car share and park and rides that other communities are doing that help enable people to utilize different transportation options. So next steps with that sort of framework in place, we've wrapped up our first round of stakeholder focus groups. We're moving into this evaluation of peer communities, identifying our issues and opportunities, and starting to think about what our recommendations might be. And then we will go back to our steering committee and our focus groups as we develop those recommendations, get feedback to make sure we're on the right track, or make sure we're not missing anything, see if they are the right approaches that we want to start moving forward. And then the idea is to have that action plan and all of our recommendations wrapped up by the end of the year. And finally, the last piece related to that, as we move forward into our recommendations, we want a good way to evaluate potential. So as we develop opportunities that we could be implementing, how are we going to evaluate those and move them forward? So this is another area where I think we're potentially looking for feedback if you have any, but trying to think about recommendations that are right size for Missoula, that we're not just taking something from another community that isn't appropriate or doesn't match the conditions that are in Missoula, but being thoughtful and forward thinking. Again, we want to be collaborative and flexible, so we're not putting all of the onus on one group or one particular entity, and that flexibility that gets us to a range of choices or opportunities to work within, but still maintaining that clear and objective outcome, that we have goals and we want to achieve that. And so any flexibility has to move us towards those outcomes. And then capacity is always going to be a big one, making sure we have the capacity for whatever we're recommending implementing, or that we have the ability to create the capacity to implement that. And then finally, with equitability and effectiveness and the cost to implement sort of being additional ways to evaluate this, any recommendations that we're putting forward. So trying to be thoughtful in what we develop and how we're taking those sort of best practices and applying them in Missoula. So that is a lot of information and a lot of me talking. So I will stop and open it up for any questions or comments or thoughts on particularly the evaluation or our best practice and peer review framework, sort of as we move into this next step of the process. I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Aaron. This is exciting work. I get excited about this because these soft infrastructure things can be very cost effective, and it's an alternative to hard infrastructure investments that are very costly to do. And I appreciate the work you're doing around finding the barriers, because I think understanding what the reasons are that people choose not to use other transportation options is really important, whether that's a car share or having a childcare option close by, or whether it's a safety issue, whether it's a consideration of whether they can get to those transportation options safely. I think that's identifying those barriers is probably the key in getting more participation. So great work on that. I've got Corey and then Ben.
Yeah, I almost don't know where to begin. That was a lot. Thank you, though. I would be really interested to learn more about what the other communities or peer communities that you're looking at, what they're doing. I think that we need to be more bold and try some things that maybe others are not willing to do. Somebody's got to be the first one. And so I think we could be really creative, and we could be really forward thinking on how we do some of this to really push this single occupancy vehicle percentage. Because right now we're not moving the bar much.
Yeah, and I totally agree. You know, on some level, I think Missoula is one of the peer communities. So when this is happening in other places, Missoula is often one of the places where they look to see what we're doing. So we may not learn everything we need to know or what we need to do from that peer community evaluation, but I think it gives us a really good start of here's what's working in other places and what we can draw on or expand from. So, but yeah, I think you're right. There are some things that we may need to just be the first to try it, which is always a scary prospect, but.
Well, there was an idea thrown out there about, let's just buy everybody in Missoula an electric bike, and that will solve all the problems. Was that you, Ben?
Yep. That was
I
a
like
New
it.
York Times article. I mean, it's a fairly mainstream idea.
So I can tell you from the perspective of someone whose husband, who is not a spring chicken, who bought an electric bike and nearly killed himself. They're not for everybody.
Aaron, I think that this is really great work, and I agree with the direction that it's going, and it makes sense. I'm curious, where is increased parking management in this evaluation? I mean, study after study shows that Donald Shoup's book, Free Parking, is the biggest barrier to people using transportation options. So as long as parking is plentiful and cheap, we're not going to move the dial. And so how are we addressing that in this transportation option study?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can't talk about transportation without parking. So feels like I spend more time, and Ian will probably agree with that, spend more time talking about parking than in just about anything else. We're trying, I think we'll look at parking in a number of different ways. It's one of our specific topic areas for peer, our best practice peer evaluation. Like, what are other places doing around parking requirements, parking management, doing increased shared parking, thinking about shared parking differently, sort of all of these strategies. And I think we've had good conversations with Ian about what's the direction we're taking in downtown, and it's a good opportunity to do some pilots potentially. So I think parking is going to be in every element that we talk about, whether it's recommendations or managed parking or expansion of the parking district, whatever that might be. So I think it came up a lot in our conversations, and it will continue to be part of what we recommend.
Okay, that's good to hear. I did not see management considerations in that list. So maybe that is part of it. And then the other one that I didn't see was, and maybe this is too specific, but decoupling. This is one in some of my conversations with developers. The concept is they just didn't understand even that was possible, that our code says that you need a parking space per unit, so they assume that it comes with the unit. But the idea of separating out what the parking spaces from the units so that they could be sold separately, people that wanted to not have a vehicle could maybe pay less for their unit, and other people who had more cars could pay more for parking spaces, that sort of thing. I imagine that's going to be part of what gets looked at, but that wasn't on the list also.
Yeah, no, I think that will be in there to some degree. I mean, we'll see where there has been evidence of success or failure, or where places are trying. But I think as we get into more looking at different strategies, that will likely be there, along with I think there are some really good conversations that we had around shared parking and thinking about parking differently, that we always are so focused on having parking right at a site, instead of thinking about, well, maybe a downtown developer, instead of investing in parking downtown, could invest in a park and ride that's next to transit, and that creates capacity in an area where we maybe don't need the land for development as much, or those kinds of strategies where our code doesn't really allow for that very well right now. And that's that area of thinking more creatively about parking and transportation demand. Again, that's one example. It may not be the right one for us, but it's something that came up in conversation, even from developers, that they didn't feel like there was a lot of flexibility around sort of shared parking or how we manage that, as kind of as a region, rather than just site specific.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands. Thanks for that great presentation. Excited to see where this is going. And I think, you know, with our code work that we're doing in the coming months, I think this dovetails nicely to have some recommendations to go right into that code rewrite process, and hopefully those things can get adopted into that hard code as we update that work. So,
yep. Great. And we'll have more updates as we go, you know, probably as we start to develop some of our peer evaluation and recommendations. We'll definitely be coming back for some review and thoughts about that. So,
Aaron, is there an adoption process for this study? Is this going to become some formal part of either our growth policy or transportation plan?
I think it'll become the goal is to have it be an amendment to the long range transportation plan, at least through the MPO. And then I think for city and or county could be just again, it's a plan or recommendations. I don't know that it needs to be adopted or it will be structured in a way that it makes sense to adopt it as a amendment to the growth policy. But I think the idea is that there's some tacit buy-in from the city and from city council that they're interested in these recommendations and wanting to move forward with them. And then how they get implemented, I think we'll have a series of recommendations, and then how those get implemented, you know, isn't always exactly as you plan, but I think we can pursue those as we go through code updates and things like that.
Yeah, I think that'll be important.
Yeah.
Ian?
Well, I wanted to say it was refreshing to hear Donald Schutz's name mentioned. But I did have a question, and does anyone have a pulse on the change in the workforce, you know, in terms of, you know, the hoteling spaces for businesses in downtown? Is it moving back towards all employees are reporting back 5 days a week in office, or is there kind of a shift in, you know, the teleworking versus on-site work? Because that will help shape whatever type of programs, you know, that we can offer. If a lot of folks are working 3 days a week, you know, that pay as you go option instead of the monthly option might be more economical. And just trying to figure that. That's one question I've been asking around, and I'm unsure of, is what the dynamic of the workforce in Missoula is shaping out to be with COVID.
Yeah, it's a great question.
From the van puller's perspective, when COVID hit, probably a quarter of the riders retired permanently. Another quarter are teleworking. They're still teleworking. Some of them have gone back to work a couple days a week, but certainly not 5 days a week. We're having a lot of employers say they're going to switch from the 5-day workday down to a 4. So I would see that pressures on parking are probably going to still be reduced for the short term anyway.
I was just going to chime in that we're working on a survey to do with all of the members of the Missoula Downtown Association, just getting a better understanding of their what they are doing currently to promote transportation options. But that would be something that we can add into that, is just to get a sense of who's currently working remotely. And yeah, that's a good. We should talk about that more, Ian. And I think doing a survey just to capture all of the employers we work with and seeing if we can get a better understanding. I know nationally they're saying that like a lot of employers have recommended like being in the office at minimum 2 days a week is beneficial. And we've seen that through the Association of Commuter Transportation. So they're kind of planning on kind of a 3-2 work week, 3 days at home being the maximum. But I don't know if that's true locally.
Maybe you could partner with the Chamber of Commerce and pull their members at the same time, and maybe get a citywide feel for it rather than just the downtown.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of thinking of, making it broader, because I think that's a really important question. And I don't know if now is the right time to do it, or if you want to wait longer and see if we are officially back to normal. Or I don't know, there might need to be some thought put into that as well.
My recommendation would be to do it now so that you've got those answers when you're looking for solutions to what the study's recommending. I mean, that would certainly drive my decisions as to what I would implement if, you know, a quarter of the workforce isn't going to be going back to work. They're going to be telecommuting.
Yeah.
And we are kind of seeing that. Unfortunately, I don't have the history because I just started in July, but what things look like, you know, pre-COVID, especially in our lease lots. But we are kind of ramping up our occupancy surveys, focusing in on those lease lots, which are usually folks working downtown. And, you know, there's a lot of room in there. And, you know, folks are hanging on to leases for when they do need to come in, and just basically how to manage the split work week, you know, 3 days here, 2 days at home, or 2 days in office, 3 days at home. You know, there's a lot of parking leases out there that aren't being used. So, you know, having that information could really help shape what type of programs we can offer.
All right, very good. We ready to move on to our next item? Next one is discussion on the emerging mobility playbook.
Yes, this is another kind of informational presentation this month, but it feels like a good opportune time to talk about the emerging mobility playbook that we had as part of the long range transportation plan. We had attached it to the agenda, the full playbook. So hopefully some of you have had a chance to read through it, but there are just a lot of conversations going on right now around emerging mobility. And so we wanted to get this on your radar as a resource that we have, and start thinking about what next steps we might want to implement from the playbook around how we're going to address emerging mobility in Missoula. It just feels like a good opportunity. So this is kind of an overview of what's in the playbook, and we can either have a conversation of what we might want to bring back and have more detailed discussion on, or, you know, we're continuing to work on this at a staff level, but just to hopefully spark some conversation or think about what directions we might want to go around emerging mobility as the MPO, or as the city and the county, or the state DOT. And it relates a lot to the transportation options plan. So a lot of what's in the emerging mobility are going to be critical elements of having a successful transportation options program around the city. So these two, I think they go fairly well together, and we'll try to get through this. So Charlie, John, and I are going to kind of break this one up so you don't just have to listen to me talk for another 20 minutes or so. So overview of what we're going to talk about is what is emerging mobility. So making sure, again, we have common definitions of what we're talking about when we're talking about emerging mobility. It's not just autonomous vehicles. We want to talk a little bit about the challenges and opportunities. There's a lot of detail in the playbook. We're not going to go over all of that, but just hit some highlights. Talk about some case studies that do a good job of highlighting some of these issues. Again, those case studies don't illustrate every emerging mobility, but are good highlights of how all this can kind of fit together, and ways that other communities are starting to address this. And then talk about some next steps of where we can and where we should go around emerging mobility. So first question is, why is emerging mobility important? And, you know, I think we all have a general sense of this, but the pace of change around transportation is faster than it has ever been. It seems like there are new tools or new modes or new scooters or services coming out every day and every month. And it's hard to keep up with it. But these are going to be really critical tools in how we achieve our goals. So whether we're talking about scooters or car share or mobility as a service, that all of these things can and probably should be tools that we're looking to help implement our goals. And so we need to be thoughtful, not just sort of let them happen to us, but think about where they fit in to our strategy and how we're developing our transportation and mobility networks, and what the benefits are, and how we want to be as proactive as possible. And also thinking about what we have control over. So we don't have control over everything at the city or MPO level. We're not going to be able to dictate how autonomous vehicles are programmed. That is going to happen at a national or international level, and we're going to have to adapt to it. But things like how bike share programs operate in Missoula, we have a lot of control over. And so it's important to think about that framework. We'll talk about a framework for how to approach that. But emerging mobility is important for us as a region, and we need to be thinking proactively about it. So when we talk about emerging mobility, there's a lot there, and we could probably spend the next hour talking about all the different things. But generally thinking big picture, it's mobility that is technology enabled. So thinking about how our relationship to technology and how that affects our transportation system. Emerging mobility tends to enable shared and owner operated mobility. So things like Uber and Lyft is an initial where it's ride hailing or ride sharing, and we have bike share coming out. So there are all these options of starting to move towards more of community-based transportation options instead of all just individually owned vehicles in each household. Emerging mobility is really built on this idea of information infrastructure. So you need really good data and information in order for these things to be successful. So we have smartphones now that are collecting vast amounts of data and information, and there are new ways to share that information and use it to identify needs and opportunities. And then thinking about connections. So we have trying to connect either different modes or different locations, thinking about how all of these things are operating and connecting within our existing public transit and active transportation networks, and helping make those more efficient. And really will help enable travel behavior change, or we hope, and we're seeing this, I think, emerge in other places, that the more options you have and the easier they are to access and facilitate those, that it just reduces the barriers to adoption of different modes. Because you could try out a bike share a couple of days here or there, and then maybe you decide you really like biking and shift into that, or you have good resources for transit, to support transit ridership for either the first or last mile, or if you ride the bus to work, you have these other options in downtown or where your employment is for errands and other trips. And then emerging mobility can and should respond to policy direction. So what we establish as our policy as a community is going to dictate in a lot of ways how these emerging mobilities are implemented and how they function in Missoula. So there's sort of a couple of different elements to emerging mobility. There's the modes and services, so things like car share and ride hailing and microtransit, all of the different ways that the different modes or types of emerging mobility. But then there are also all of these supportive elements, things like we talked about with apps, or electrification, or plans like we're talking about with our Playbook, and the data and standards that are associated with that. There's whole industries around data standards and how we're collecting data with all of these different shared mobility or different types of services. And that can impact what we have access to at the local level, and how we could utilize that data for our own purposes. And then there's thinking about how we act on emerging mobility. So there are management tools for this. There are our policies, our regulations. We had a lot of discussion at the city council about 2 years ago around e-scooters and bike share and scooter share services. And those things aren't going away, and we need to figure out a way to address them. There's also our practices in terms of how we're coordinating with these different services and amongst different agencies, and then thinking about programs and pilots. So how are we starting to deploy these? Do we just open the door and the floodgates and let them happen, or are we trying to step into it and thinking about establishing pilots and evaluating these new tools over time and implementing them in the most effective way? And then obviously funding is a big question on where is that coming from? Is it public funding? Is it private? Are there partnerships that we can do to help achieve our goals? And funding can often be a way to help expand the benefits of a particular program beyond what the private sector may be interested in doing. So a lot to think about there in terms of managing emerging mobility. So that's the overview. There again, there's a lot of great detail in the playbook that I would encourage you to read through and just sort of get your head into the realm of what emerging mobility means. But I'm going to turn it over to Charlie now to talk about challenges and opportunities with emerging mobility and specifically to Missoula. So Charlie.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. One thing I think the emerging mobility playbook produced by Nelson Nygaard provide us really good information on is the challenges. So where we stand currently with integrating emerging mobility services and the opportunities, which was supported by the long range transportation plans programs sections, programs and policies. I'm going to need to, yep. So an important thing is to get a basis of the history around emerging mobility in Missoula. Sort of one of the initial steps that was taken at the city scale was a signal optimization project that occurred in 2011. And signal optimization is just part of a larger ITS effort that is necessary for the integration of autonomous vehicles. Something else that's important is in 2015, Montana passed Senate Bill 396, which enabled regulation of transportation services like Lyft and Uber. And that brought Lyft and Uber to our city and county in later years. In 2018, Mountain Lion published their strategic plan with direction from microtransit partnerships. So it's included in micromobility and emerging mobility is included in multiple plans adopted and supported across the Missoula area. In 2019, Missoula passed ordinances defining electric bikes and how they can be used on our primary commuter trails. And then 2019, this is sort of one of our challenge areas, is 2019 City Council tabled discussion of shared mobility and e-scooter program ordinances. So e-scooter and e-bike shared mobility programs are sort of a rudimentary part of emerging mobility. So bringing back this discussion and reanalyzing the benefits and costs of such programs could be initial state of bringing back emerging mobility programs to Missoula. I'll shift us to the next slide. So just a general background or some key strengths that Missoula has for emerging mobility is we currently do have a robust network of protected bikeways that support use of shared micromobility for all ages and abilities. So thinking about how if shared mobility, scooters and bikes were integrated, there is a network of infrastructure to support this, and safety wouldn't be as large of a concern as it is in many other places. We have support at the city and county level for energy conservation and resiliency-oriented action. Missoulians have also on their own developed personal micromobility, demonstrating that there's probably larger market support for pedal and e-assist devices we used in our area rental. And key opportunities. So this is kind of brings back to our transportation options plan, some of the major aspects. So coordinating with partners, this can play off of some of the programs and policy work laid out in the long range transportation plan, which identify who are key partners in organizing around various emerging mobility or supportive network changes that would benefit emerging mobility. Connecting with peers, so also with the transportation options, as well as with this emerging mobility playbook, we've identified peer cities that we can use their information as examples for how to model our ordinances or how to integrate a variety of emerging mobility efforts. And then we've also set up in the emerging mobility playbook a rough outline on what is necessary for piloting these emerging mobility services. So it's important to approach them with a short-term pilot, test, prove, and then official adoption before assuming that we will permanently integrate these into our city ordinances or county ordinances as as a service to stay. So that's laid out in our emerging mobility playbook. And then also thinking about how we can coordinate across policies. So in the city's growth policy update, what ideas and what can be integrated to support emerging mobility services. So we can think of mobility hubs as one. That's an idea that we've been in discussion with in growth policy, as well as with Mountain Line, and how a mobility hub, for a singular example, can be used as something that integrates more than just bus, bike, and walking to connect people across our network. So I think John is going to take this away with case studies to show how we can coordinate and build off of peers' work.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. Appreciate it. So we have 3 communities that we looked at with 3 different examples of micro or emerging mobility examples. So the first one is in Boulder, Colorado. It's called Colorado Car Share. Their mission is to empower the community to live a car-free lifestyle and have positive impact on health, wealth, and the shared environment, making their community healthier and more socially equitable place to live. The car share here was that we're talking about was established in Boulder in the late 90s and then expanded into Denver in later years. So that's pretty cool to see that it was initiated in a smaller community. Started with 1 car, 2016. They celebrated having over 50 cars, and then for their 20th year in service, they started electrification of the fleet. In 2006, they received a 501c3 nonprofit status. So pretty cool to see how public-private partnerships can work with this type of program. And then the locations are also integrated with bike share systems. And so that leads us into our next case study of Ann Arbor. Oh, excuse me. I switched those slides. We're good at Boise. This is a really interesting city to look at, similar to transportation options, keeping in mind the scale of cities and needs. In 1970, Boise was the size of Missoula, and currently they're approaching 300,000 people. So I like to look at Boise for case studies, also similar type of community with similar recreation opportunities, university town. So around a couple years before Missoula was contemplating the e-bike, e-scooter ordinance, Boise City Council was addressing this as well. They adopted a City of Boise e-bike ordinance, which established no ride zones. A little different than Missoula, they did decide to let private scooter companies come in. So they have 3 scooter companies, and that ordinance addresses how to deal with the public's concerns about safety regarding e-bikes and scooters. So parking restrictions, regulations, they have a really nice website that it's kind of a know before you go. And another unique thing that Boise did was adopted an e-bike ADA accommodation system. And so that map on the right, all of the trails in yellow, they allow e-bikes on, and then they're prohibited on the red trails. And so this is to allow access and opportunities for folks who still like to get out and e-bike recreationally, and allows them to do so. And of course, our primary focus is commuter transportation, but you know, it all goes hand in hand when you're looking at the bigger picture. The other case study we looked at is Ann Arbor, Michigan, and this is an example of a mobility hub. Mobility hubs are places of connectivity where different modes of travel, walking, biking, shared mobility converge and often concentrated in an area of employment, housing, shopping, or recreation. So this project was completed in 2012 as part of the city's municipal parking system. And kind of a cool thing about having these other modes of transportation near parking is that it brings awareness to the users who are using the parking garage. They might park there and see that there's a bus or a bike share opportunity. So kind of expanding the knowledge of transportation options. A lot of mobility hubs are used for first mile, last mile gaps. And another thing to keep in mind about mobility hubs is they can be different scales. So this is an example of one we would, potentially see at the Missoula Downtown Transfer Center, but there could be smaller mobility hubs around the community, like the transfer center at the mall, or looking into that micro transit and making those connections. So the next slide, I think it made it in here. We just wanted to bring up V2X, which is vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to infrastructure, vehicle to deer. This is a emerging component of mobility options, and no really specific examples of how this is working yet, except new vehicles that folks are buying today have components of this technology integrated, such as automatic braking or the lane change and even the self parking. So this is something we just wanted to mention to just so everyone is aware of it, and it's really a critical part of the ITS system. And that is all I have for you. Pass it over to Aaron again.
Yeah, thanks. So, that's a lot of what's happening, opportunities, and so I think the question for us, or for that we need to start working on is what comes next, or how do we get it done around emerging mobility? We're not going to be able to do it all at once, and so we need to think about sort of what are bite-sized pieces we can tackle, and how do we approach these things, and what's the process we go through. And the playbook has some really good structure for how to think about emerging mobility. And at the highest level, we're thinking about this as a component of our larger regional transportation planning process, and thinking about a similar kind of strategy of doing our multimodal planning, thinking about the specific planning interventions. So, what kinds of policies are we establishing, partnerships that we want to establish, and then thinking about the next step, which is project implementation. So what are pilots? What is the infrastructure needs? What sorts of data do we need to have access to, or data systems, or IT platforms? What's the technology side that we need? And then actually doing some pilots and getting the work out there. And then having this evaluation and learning, which is a really important piece of all the work that we do in planning, but in this in particular, we're really going to have to be on top of evaluation of these types of activities, whether we're doing a pilot or launching a new program. And then once we've done that evaluation and learning, we're back in the planning stage and thinking about changes that we want to make or directions we're going, and you sort of start the cycle all over again. So that's kind of the larger framework that we need to keep in mind. And then specific to emerging mobility, that we've identified in the playbook, this framework for success. So how do we approach these different technologies and modes and innovative ideas that are coming out in a way that is proactive and gets us on the front foot instead of just reacting? And so there's sort of a 3-step process that we've outlined in the playbook that we're suggesting to follow regardless of what project we're working on around emerging mobility. And it starts with setting the foundation. So identifying what our goals are, doing enough background work, looking for opportunities, what are our barriers, and what are the different types of technologies that can help address that. So getting that framework or that initial baseline set up in terms of what are our goals, what are our objectives, what are the barriers, and what are our tools, and how do we want to use them. That's really the first step we should be taking on any of these. Then the next step is to actually take action, not waiting for something to happen, but think about doing implementation, establishing pilot programs, looking for partnerships, whether that's with a shared mobility provider or a local partner, or creating our own partnership, like that Boulder's example of the 501c3, could be a really great example of establishing a public-private partnership that has public seed money, gets private financing, and allows us to have control over how this kind of tool is implemented in Missoula. And then finally, we want to apply lessons. So we want to do that ongoing monitoring and evaluation and data collection and iterations of these projects, and making sure we're documenting that, we're identifying the lessons learned, and then we're applying those as we either move on to the next project, or as we're thinking about changes to an ongoing program or project. So again, it's that holistic life cycle of how we're thinking about emerging mobility, and starting with the foundations and sort of those big picture goals and policies first before we get into launching any new endeavor. But then also making sure we're evaluating and moving forward with things that are successful. And if they're not, we should adjust and adapt, because if anything, now we are a rapidly changing community, and things are going to continue to change, and that gives us a lot of opportunity to not feel like we're stuck in any one given approach. So the playbook has some good detail about what each of these phases mean. In terms of setting the foundation, making sure we have good guiding principles, understanding the baseline, like what sort of infrastructure do we have in place, what do we need, are we fostering the local culture when we're thinking about scooters, how, as one example that always seems to come up, what is the local culture around that, how are we establishing roles and managing that emerging technology, and doing all of that before we are launching a program. And then as we're thinking about taking action, we're making sure we're targeting problems in our community, that we're not just putting something out there for the sake of putting it out there, even though that may be something that happens. I don't know that we want to restrict anything, but when we're taking action, it should be to target problems that we're building on our current efforts and existing programs and projects, that we have the right partners, and that we're connecting with peer communities to make sure we're learning from them and what they've done, and that we have the right policy in place to adequately pilot and test these out, so we're not creating more problems for ourselves with a new technology, because there's just as much opportunity for creating unintended consequences as there are solving our existing problems with some of these technologies. And then finally, applying lessons. So we want to make sure we have good performance metrics defined, so that we are monitoring and measuring the right things, and we're thinking about that up front with the idea of data systems. Every program has a different data standards or ways that they collect and provide data. So establishing those metrics up front, making sure when we do pilots that we adequately evaluate them to make sure that they are a success, and that we have process in place to determine what our actions are depending on the level of success that we're seeing or failure. And then not being afraid to adjust and repeat, that we shouldn't take failure in any particular emerging mobility and say that we should never do that again. We should learn from it and then try to figure out ways to make it better. So it's always about doing regular evaluation, adjusting, continuing to learn from what we do. And chances are a year from when you implement a pilot, there will be new technology or new changes that are happening somewhere else that we can then integrate and think about how we would modify. So I think the key here is not to be afraid of trying things, that we have good opportunities to be creative and to test out pilots and move some of these things forward, as long as we have a good framework and goals in place, and we're ensuring safety, and that there aren't going to be sort of really people dying from it, or creating really lasting impacts, but be bold in how we take some of these technologies and try to implement our goals. So there's just related to pilots, there's some good detail in there, and I will not go, we're running a little short on time, but just thinking about what makes a successful pilot, that just going out and doing something and calling a pilot isn't enough, that we have to be thoughtful about understanding it, what it is we want to get out of it, planning for it, being making sure that the right partners and others are engaged, going through the launching phase, the operating, and again, coming back to that evaluation, that all of those things are the sort of components of what makes a successful pilot. So again, the playbook has really a lot more detail on some of this that really gives us a roadmap for how we can start approaching some of these issues and being proactive and thinking about it. So, and then at the end, there's kind of bringing it all together. There, we've started with a table of potential initial projects related to each of our long-range transportation goals, and where we might start tackling these in each of these phases over the next 2 to 5 years. So again, a good roadmap for how we can start, like, where our opportunities and strengths are as a community, and what that means for what we might want to start engaging with. And again, there's really good overlap, I think, with this and the Transportation Options Action Plan, because we've been having good conversations around some emerging mobility in that transportation options conversations around things like car share. And there are really good examples out there of different ways to implement car share and different ways to use it to achieve our goals as a community. And the further you start going down those steps, you start realizing, well, there's opportunities with car share and electrification and our sustainability goals and funding that's coming out of the federal government for electric vehicle public charging infrastructure. And how do we bring those things together? And I think those are good examples of we need to be thoughtful and we need to be proactive about this and not let it sort of just happen. But if we do, I think we can start achieving a lot of really clear goals that we have as a community and making real progress with some targeted investments. So it's a really good resource, and we should continue to come back to this as a tool as we start having conversations about these different modes or different services that are starting to become available. So that is what comes next is, I think, up to us in terms of deciding where we want to focus our energy. And I don't know that we need to finalize that today, but I'm just curious what all of you think in the work that you do. I think this is a good diverse group of people, working in different arenas, and be interesting to think about how emerging technology can fit in or where we might want to prioritize our efforts. So that is what we have on the playbook. So I'll stop sharing and see if there are any comments or questions or thoughts on where we might want to head.
Thanks, Aaron. I love the connection you made to the transportation options plan there at the end. I think this is the opportunity, Corey said, to be bold around some pilot projects and try some things out. And I do think there's a great opportunity to bring some incentives to potential projects, development projects that would incorporate some of these things. With new potential money out there to do things like electric charging stations or a car share program, that could be a great way to get some of this launched at a small scale to get it started. Okay, other comments from the committee? All right.
I know we're short on time, so I don't want to say much, but this is really this is fantastic. This is the stuff that gets me excited. And I want to be sure that we keep it moving forward and we don't just put it on the shelf and forget about it. So, which I don't think we will. But
Aaron, since we are short on time, what would you like from this committee in terms of feedback?
That's a good question. I think we've been struggling a little bit with how to, the playbook gives us a really good framework for how to approach this and potentially some pilots. I think it might be good, and we could come back and have a future conversation in the next couple of months to just talk through some opportunities that might be out there. But I think with a lot of these, it's identifying who needs to be in the room to talk about a pilot, or, maybe back up. The first step is, what are some pilots that we might want to look at potentially launching around emerging mobility? Like where is there some opportunity for a pilot? And then who needs to be in the room to start that conversation and moving us in the direction towards implementation. So if it's car share, who needs to be involved in planning a car share pilot, and do we want to move towards just encouraging a private company to come here? Or do we want to look at a nonprofit model, or starting those conversations and moving us along? And I think this group has a lot of the right players to think about what that looks like. Even again on the car, I don't want to harp too much on the car share, but the county moving towards doing kind of a car share model for the fleet to get to electrification, could have, the city could potentially do something similar, or, how can we pool our resources? That's a lot of rambling, but I think that is, and not necessarily getting to your question, but having that conversation about what do we want to focus on, and who needs to be in the room, and how do we want to start moving that forward, those things forward.
So I think this is worthy of some more discussion. Could we put this on the agenda for next month to continue and have a little more discussion with the committee about what we think are real opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely.
Ben?
Thanks. I just wanted to ask if you're planning on making the same presentation to either Public Works Committee or even Committee of the Whole of City Council, because at least, the aspect of this that I'm most familiar with, the bike and scooter share provisions, we don't have good direction right now from council to pick that back up again. And until we do, I feel like I'm kind of spinning wheels. So I would love some more direction to to either pick that up again or put it down.
Yeah, I think it's a good presentation for city council, and maybe a good presentation for the county. I don't know if this is something that the commissioners would be interested in. I mean, we'll do it for TPCC, so that's potentially 2 of the 3. But if there's a venue, at the county to have that conversation too about how this, because I think there's a lot of opportunities both for the city and the county to start moving on some of these things.
And I think that becomes stronger if this committee has some recommendations. If we can come to the city council or commissioners and say, these are things that we think we should be focusing on right now. Corey?
Yeah, just one last thing. For the next meeting, it would be helpful if beforehand, if you could just think of what are a few key questions or things that you want us to think about or come with answers to. It would give us the opportunity to think beforehand rather than on the fly. So
yeah, sure, I can do that.
Okay, I do want to be respectful of people's time. We have one more agenda item that I'm very interested in hearing, but is that something that we want to continue to talk about today, or do you want to kick that to the next meeting?
I think we could kick that to the next meeting. I mean, it's something that's changing, and there will probably be there will definitely be a lot more information next month on infrastructure bill. I mean, even in the time that we've been putting this really high level overview together, we've gotten more details. So, and Ryan, looks like you have a comment on this, so I suspect you'll have a lot of details too.
Yeah, I mean, my only comment was going to be that just within the last couple of days, the Federal Highway Administration has begun its process of kind of putting out explainers on this and trying to turn the bill into plain language, so to speak. So if you go to FHWA's website, fhwa.dot.gov, and then there's a / and it's bipartisan-infrastructure-law, or you could probably just Google it. Or Aaron, I can send you the direct link, and then maybe you can distribute. But again, there's fact sheets and there's some state specific documents that I think were probably AI generated, but they're still accurate and good and worthwhile to read and all that. So yeah, I mean, the quality and quantity of the information will continue to improve going forward, but we are starting down that path, and I'd appreciate or recommend that you check out this page in the meantime.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think that information is really just starting to flow. I've just in the last week started to see a lot more. So if we could have that on the agenda for next month, maybe we'll have a little better sense of what's coming.
Yep, absolutely.
Good deal. Well, thanks everyone. Are there any final announcements or closing comments? Okay, seeing none, we will be adjourned.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.